When did you first hear about the encampment?
Oh, God. I can't remember. I'm assuming that I heard about it through Quaker meeting, being a Quaker. Probably connected with Cindy Sangre around it. And I very often have been very angry at our country for being predators, for not being at peace with the world. So the idea of having a peace encampment, when I knew that there were other encampments around the world, appealed to me. Because so much of my life I'm not an international woman, because I'm so sheltered by our culture, that I thought it was a good thing. So I just kind of knew it was like, okay, it's over there. I'll get involved at some point. Well, I was a Quaker, and I came to be a Quaker in my early 20s when I started to protest the Vietnam War when I was a little bit younger, and I actually did draft counseling and helped the movement to help people document and be conscientious objectors through the Vietnam War. So my parents were devout Democrats, so that, and my dad was a World War II vet. And I remember as a kid asking him, and he just died recently. He just died June 16th, so about a month ago. But when I was a kid, I used to ask him about the war, and I read a lot of books about Ernie Pyle. He used to do a column daily about the war, and I was mesmerized by it. And I asked my dad about it, and he said, "War is terrible," and he wouldn't talk to me about it. And he just kept saying it was horrible. And there were times when I was a kid that we all knew that war was horrible, and he would have flashbacks, and it was sort of a family joke because he would have dreams and he would attack my mother, and it was a family joke that she became good at leaping out of bed and screaming at him to wake up. And none of us knew then that it was post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was wounded and nearly died in the war. So, it was, I just grew up learning that war was horrible and destroyed people. I did demonstrate. I demonstrated in high school, but that demonstrating was sneaking out of the house and doing it. I was in high school in Maine, and I was on the debate team, and we had a wonderful debate coach who, you had to have a B average to be on the debate team. And if you had more than a B average and your debate wasn't perfect, then you were bad. For this coach, school and grades were a means to get you on the debate team. School was secondary to debate. So she used to sign for me to take days off, and I would go to the University of Maine and work on research for our debates. And I became involved in Students for a Democratic Society on the campus of Maine, which my parents never knew. And so I participated in a lot of that. And actually one night we were doing a major demonstration against Vietnam, the war, and I made it on television. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get murdered for this. But you know what? My parents didn't see it. But my debate coach did. Oh my God, she was mad. She said, "You better do a good debate." So she kind of knew, that she was my little freedom. And she would write me out passes all the time. All I had to do was go and say I needed data research. I became involved in the university, and our school did not have a newspaper, and they wouldn't let us have a newspaper. So I got the head of the Orno campus editor to help us and we started to rally for newspaper. And that year, we just, you know, went after that high school. And by the end of the year, we had a newspaper. And about, it had to be about 15 years ago, I was headed up to Maine. We rafted down the Allagash. And I said to my partner, who was then Evelyn, I said, let's stop at the high school. And I stopped in at the high school. And it was really funny because they said, I graduated in '69, and they said, I said, so what's it like? What's the student population like? And he said, you know, we've had a really good student population for many years. We haven't had a problem here since 1969. I don't remember particularly nuclear. I was opposed to all war. War in general, when I was a kid, we were worried about nuclear war. I mean, I remember my parents' big philosophical discussions about whether or not they should build a bomb shelter, you know, off the basement. And I remember those discussions. I remember discussions, my best friends, their parents decided, and my parents really looked at building this bomb shelter. And my neighbor's parents decided that what they would do is they would get a gun, and if it ever came to a nuclear war, they were prepared to kill the kids and them themselves. You know, and so those discussions I remember. You know, and of course, when I was a kid, there was the get under your desk and cover your head stuff. It was bigger than us, it was women, it was inclusive. You know, it just, and it was fun. Fun, and there were lots of really neat women. There were lots of meetings on consensus, which made me crazy, even though I'm a Quaker and we deal with consensus. But they pretty much made me crazy because with consensus, you make a commitment to look at the whole picture. And many of the women who were trying to do consensus weren't looking at the whole picture. You know, they were hanging on to their own ideas. So it was very hard to do consensus, where I've not experienced consensus being a Quaker as being that difficult, probably because we're all like-minded. So, you know, that idea of negotiating and give and take and looking at what you can let go of and not lose the principle, you know, wasn't there. So the meetings that were consensus made me nuts. And that's why when you look at, I chose to do things other than, I mean, I helped hire staff. I did that. I did, what did we call it? Was it the womb? The
Healing room.
The healing room. Yeah, I did the healing room with the herbs and stuff and learned a lot about that. I worked on the land, you know, but I very often was missing from those meetings because they made me nuts. I have a funny story about consensus. I became known as somebody who was like a social worker at the peace encampment. And we had one woman on the land who had decided she would come there and she'd go off her meds, which was very common. So she had done that, and she was nuts. And so I was in the process of getting her to go for an evaluation at, was it Tompkins Hospital down near Ithaca. And do either of you remember this? No? Oh, it was funny. So I was arranging that, and some women came to me and said, you know, we don't believe that this is good feminist process, that we have to shelter our sister, and you can't do that. And there were about 3 of them, and I said, you know what, I'll tell you what, let's do it in the feminist process. I said, you get a group of women together who can be her support, and I will be your support in helping you support her. So they got a group of about 8 women together, and she was among it. When we all sat down, we got ground rules that whenever anything was wrong, she's going to go to them. and that if they had trouble, they would come to me. And so we set this all up, and they were her support system. And she was psychotic. And so it took about 4 days for that group to come back to me and say, you know what? She really needs a hospital. Can you take care of that? And we did. It would have been 1985, I'm thinking. Or when did we buy the Peace Camp?
83.
For spring of 83. Okay, so we went through a full year. We got lots of money. And after that year, what we did was we gave away all the money. Right? Then, when it came to spring 84, we're going to run it again and hire all these people. And what happened was the county, I guess, had come in and said, you can't run this peace encampment. You know, if you were to have a peace encampment, you would have to apply for a camp to be a campground. And you'd have to have architectural drawings, and you'd have to have all this stuff. They gave us a list of what we needed. And so, because I didn't want to be part of those meetings, I said, I will take this, and I will make us a camp. And so I actually got architects to donate time to do the drawings of the land, figured out we had to do water lines, and we had to dig for the outhouses, so we had to do that. And I took a second mortgage on the house, my house in the city, not this one, in the amount of $10,000. So that we could use that money. We had to drill a well, we had to do the porta-janes, we had to put water to the back of the land. And so that's what the money was for, that $10,000. And we thought that money would come in as it did the first year, and it didn't. So it was pretty scary. Mm-hmm. It was pretty scary. You know, I could have survived if I had to pay for it, but I didn't, thank God. David Swift came through. The Peace Camp paid the loan, and I think it was an 18-month loan, $10,000, so it was probably like $800 a month or something like that, and the Peace Camp paid it. So I never suffered at all. And then he took over that. He paid off that amount, and then the Peace Camp just paid him. I took the money thinking that we would raise that money. So I never thought that I would take a loss, but yes, I was willing to do that. There's an old Quaker saying that, you've heard the term, don't just stand there, do something. Well, there's a Quaker saying, don't just do something, stand there. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so I was standing there. I believed in it. We needed it. I had the means to do it, so I did it. Going down, having a good time. I actually went over the fence one time, which was scary. It was with a large group of people, and it was an action. Uh-huh. And it was pretty, it was wonderful. You know, I tried to make connections, and I did. I went over the fence, and I was afraid of heights, and I got on the top, and I was teetering each way, and I was scared. And so I started to cry, and I said, I'm scared. I don't do this kinds of thing, but I believe in this. What the depot is doing is wrong. And this guard reached up, and he said, you're okay. Just drop yourself, and I'll catch you. And it was wonderful, and he did. I mean, they were just wonderful, and that's why they kept switching them, because the guys on the other side needed to dislike us. But if they kept them, they would rotate them every 15 minutes. Remember that? Yeah. He helped me down, and I was crying, and then he, you know, put my arms behind my back, and he put the twisty thing on, the zip thing on, but he didn't tighten it. And then when we went to sit down, he went to one place near a puddle, and I said, I don't want to sit in the puddle. Can I sit on the curb? And he let me sit where I wanted to sit. You know, I mean, he was just very sweet. But then we got in there, and of course it was horrible. It was cold, and they wouldn't let us go to the bathroom. And of course I was anxious, so I had to pee. And that was bad. And they kept us in there for hours. And then let us out a different gate. It wasn't an affinity group. I did it with a friend of mine. And she got up there, and she was so eloquent. You know, that I thought, oh God, she's so eloquent, because she was saying, you know, I'm doing this for my children and my children's children, and, you know, and I got up there and started to cry. I felt like an idiot. I don't know. You know, I don't remember, but we talked about making it after the first year, when it was so exciting and so many people were there. We talked about how to make it a permanent fixture. And so we talked about hiring staff and what we would do, and we started to get resumes, and I don't know who was head of the search committee. You know, I don't even remember interviewing people, but I know that some of these notes on people were my notes. I recognized my handwriting. No, we didn't. we thought, you know, set up a program and people will come. So that's what we did. And we were on a wing and a prayer. I mean, if we had, I mean, I can't believe we gave all that money away. I think it's funny. But we did. We just thought. We were generous. We were babies. You know? We wanted to fund the peace community. We wanted to spread peace. And so we gave the money away, knowing that more would come. Yeah. Isn't it naive? Well, I thought it was pretty exciting, because I was, you know, it was like a challenge to us. They were trying to close us down, and they said, you've got to become a camp, and, you know, and I said, well, give me what we need to do. And what I saw, I was like, oh my God. But I knew people, and actually the woman who was the architect that did the architectural drawings, what I did is I have a friend who's on the board of the Girl Scouts. So I went to the Girl Scouts. You know, they have a lot of camps and stuff.
Exactly.
And they have all volunteer women architects. And this woman was, she was in her 70s. And she was amazing. She was amazing. One of the first women architects. And when we handed them the architectural drawings, he was like, we never get anything this good.
Cool.
He was just really impressed with it. It was very impressive. Oh, every weekend.
You come down.
Yeah, and I actually took a few weeks off work when we were really under the wire to get it, you know, to be a campground. There was a lot of talk about the money not coming in and what we would do with the land, and, you know, what about caretakers and stuff like that. No, you know what? I moved on to another commitment. I went on the board of the Gay Alliance in Rochester, and ran the picnics, and then I actually became president of the board, and then I actually bought a community center for the Gay Alliance. So I moved on to doing that sort of work. Yeah, I'm sort of a change agent. You know, I go in and do my bit and then move on. I would go by it, and I was always annoyed when I'd go by it because it looked so slovenly. And I don't think I went inside. And that was difficult for me, to see that it wasn't being kept, you know. And I don't remember. It seems like there were regional meetings or something, and once in a while I'd go, because I still cared about it. I had just dropped in, did my bit to ensure that it would survive, and then kind of moved on. RAWA, Rochester Area Women Against War. And I also was not a member of that group. I hate meetings. But I was not a member. Do you know what I mean? They all probably would tell you that I was a member, but I wasn't. Oh God, a bunch of us went to an ILLIS conference in Switzerland. It was wonderful. It was such an international conference. And we stayed in the fallout shelters below the city. I remember being embarrassed when a bunch of the peace encampment women spray painted. That was embarrassing. But the conference was wonderful. So I must have been involved in the peace camp then, in '86. I'm just not remembering it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I do. I absolutely do. I think that the nuclear warheads were brought back from Europe because of that peace camp. I really felt like we had a huge impact. I have a funny story. I talked to somebody. I'm a psychotherapist, and I was doing this evaluation on a guy, and he was from Romulus. And I said, "Oh, you're from Romulus." I said, "I was part of the Women's Peace Encampment in Romulus." And he said, "You were?" He said, "I worked at the depot." And I said, "You did?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." He said, did you women really paint that water tower?" I said, "We sure did." And he started to laugh, and he said, "You know, the guys and I would argue all the time because we didn't think that women could really do that." And he's laughing. Isn't that fun? Rochester. Her mother lived in Waterloo. Her parents lived in Waterloo. And she shared with me, she was coming out and she was having her mom to dinner, and her mom and dad to dinner, and she said, "No matter what you do, do not talk about the gay issue," because I was out. And I said, "Okay." So, and that, I had worked at Planned Parenthood, and so we had this big dinner, and Franny was just totally out of her mind with anxiety about her mother coming. So she came to dinner, and we got to talk, and we hit it off immediately. And her mother said, "Well, I'm president of the Seneca County Right to Life." And I said, "You're kidding." I said, "I worked for Planned Parenthood." And Fran is like totally like, "Oh my God." Well, we hit it off. And you know, I said, I've never understood how someone can be for right to life and not care about the way children are raised and what they're born into. And I said, I think that there's a place for right to life people to ensure quality of life for babies that are born. And she said, "I totally agree with you." And we just hit it off. It was wonderful.
That's
and so, you know, I would talk to her when she'd call Fran and stuff. And so when the peace encampment was there, I stopped by and said, "Hi, I was part of the peace encampment." And so she was like, "Oh, well, if you need anything, just let me know." So when I was at the peace encampment, I would come into her house and shower. And she was always gracious about it. And I would say to her, "You want to go to the peace camp?" And she'd go, "Oh no, I'm busy." So one day she said, "I think I would like to go and see what it's about." And it was after the bridge incident. And she was a very moral and ethical woman. And she was totally incensed by what happened on that bridge. She was embarrassed. And so she went out to the peace encampment with me. And she got in the car. She said, "Oh, wait a minute, I forgot something." She goes racing back into the house. And she comes back out, gets in the car. And we went. And she was part of the groups. We got there. We got in the peace encampment, and we started walking out towards the back. And she said, well, there was this woman, this beautiful, probably Japanese woman with real long hair. And she was dancing, almost like doing a Tai Chi, but moving across the field, and she's stark naked. And I'm like, okay, what am I going to say? So I looked, I said, oh, Marion. I said, isn't she beautiful? And there was a silence, and she said, yes, she is. It was like she had to think about it, you know? And then I took her to some of the groups, and she started to talk. And she loved it. And all of a sudden, she said, oh my God, I gotta go home, I gotta go home, you gotta get me home right away, right now. And she starts towards the car, and she's moving, like almost running. And we get in the car, and we're headed back. And I said, you seemed really anxious there. And she said, I have a confession to make. I said, what? She said, my husband gets home at 3:30, and I left him a message that I'd gone to the peace encampment, that if I wasn't home, to send the police. Isn't that wonderful?